The lights in my barn flickered again. I sighed and rubbed the back of my neck, glancing toward the rafters where the bulbs were pulsing like they couldn't decide whether to stay on or give up entirely. My cow, Bessie, let out an annoyed moo from her stall, shifting her weight with a loud huff. "Yeah, girl, I feel you," I muttered, walking over to give her a pat on the side. Her soft brown eyes blinked up at me, as if she was asking, "What's going on now?" This was the third time this week. The power was cutting in and out like someone was running a hairdryer straight into the breaker box. My farm wasn't exactly high-tech, but I knew my electrical system inside and out. It didn't make sense. I stepped outside, the early evening air heavy with the scent of cut grass and warm hay. The sun was dipping low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the pasture. A light breeze tugged at the sleeves of my work shirt as I headed toward the breaker box. That's when I saw it. An orange extension cord. It snaked its way from the side of the barn, through the grass, over the fence, and straight into Kerren's house. My heart thudded hard in my chest. I walked toward it slowly, squinting to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. But no, there it was. An unmistakable bright orange line, plugged neatly into my barn's outlet and running under the fence into Kerren's side yard. My jaw tightened. Kerren. Of course it was Kerren. I followed the cord to the fence line, heart hammering in my ears. The cord was warm beneath my fingers, which meant it had been pulling power for a while. I glanced toward Kerren's house. Her front door swung open, and there she was, standing on her porch, phone in hand, wearing a floral robe and those ridiculous fuzzy slippers. She had that same tight-lipped expression she always wore, the one that made you feel like you were doing something wrong, just by existing. Kerren spotted me and raised an eyebrow. Then, like nothing was wrong, she turned her back and walked inside. I stared after her, trying to process the absolute audacity of it. It wasn't just the stolen electricity. It was Kerren stealing it. Kerren, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Kerren, who had spent the last 2 years complaining about my unkempt grass and unauthorized farm animals. Kerren, who once reported me for leaving my barn door open because it was unsightly. And now she was stealing from me? I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Marching over there and yelling wouldn't solve anything. No, Kerren was too clever for that. She'd play the victim, twist the story, and somehow make it seem like I was the bad guy. If I was going to take her down, I needed proof. Cold, undeniable proof. I walked back to the barn, my hands curled into fists. Bessie watched me as I leaned against the stall and sighed. It's always the ones you try to be nice to, huh? She blinked and let out a low, sympathetic moo. It wasn't like Kerren and I had ever been close, but we'd had our moments. Years ago, when she and Greg first moved in, I helped patch up their roof after a bad storm, brought over eggs and vegetables when they were settling in. Back then, she'd actually smiled at me. But that was before she got herself onto the HOA board. Suddenly, it was like Kerren had been possessed by some kind of suburban demon. Everything became about rules and guidelines. My wildflowers didn't match the approved aesthetic. My barn was an eyesore. And don't even get me started on the time she tried to fine me for hosting a Halloween hayride, because it was disturbing the peace. And now she was stealing from me? I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Anger was curling up in my chest, hot and sharp, but I wasn't about to lose control. If Kerren wanted to play games, I was going to give her the game of her life. But first, I needed evidence. I dug around in the back of my barn until I found what I was looking for, my old hunting camera. I hadn't used it in years, but it still worked. I mounted it above the barn door, adjusted the angle, and made sure the extension cord was perfectly framed. A little red light blinked as the camera activated. Now I just had to wait. The next morning, I sat on my porch, coffee steaming in my hands as the sun rose over the pasture. My phone buzzed. The motion sensor had picked something up. I opened the app and nearly choked on my coffee. There she was, Kerren, in her bedazzled live, laugh, love hoodie and yoga pants, dragging the extension cord across my lawn like some kind of burglar. She crouched down, plugged it into my barn outlet, and even had the nerve to look around like she was in some kind of spy movie. I watched it twice just to be sure. Then a third time, just because I couldn't believe it. She knew exactly what she was doing. My hands curled around the coffee mug. I could march over there right now, show her the footage, and call the police. But that wouldn't be enough. Kerren had spent years using the HOA to make my life miserable. It was time to give her a taste of her own medicine. I spent the rest of the day running tests. First, I turned off the main breaker in the barn. The lights went out, but Kerren's house? Still glowing like a Christmas tree. Her security lights, her porch lights, the gaudy flamingo lawn ornaments, all still lit up. Next, I flipped off my main power line. A few seconds later, Kerren's house flickered and then went dark. A slow smile spread across my face. I recorded the whole thing on my phone, flipping switches, watching the power drain from her house in real time. It was clear as day. Kerren was running her whole house off my farm's electricity. By sunset, my plan was almost complete. Kerren believed in the HOA more than anything else. The HOA was her guiding light, her source of power, pun intended. So if I wanted to hit her where it hurt, I needed to use her own obsession against her. I sat down at my desk and drafted the most official-looking letter I could create. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that unauthorized power consumption has been detected at your residence. Under Farm Utility Homeowners Association, FAA, guidelines, unauthorized power usage is subject to immediate penalties. Current assessed fees, $10,000. Failure to remit payment within 14 days will result in additional penalties, including but not limited to power disconnection and legal action. Sincerely, FAA Compliance Office. I formatted it with professional legal language and added a watermark. My buddy Tim, who used to work in a law office, even helped me make it look official. I slid the letter into an envelope marked Final Notice. Tomorrow morning, Kerren's whole world was about to turn upside down. And the best part? She'd have no one to blame but herself. The next morning, I sat at my desk with a steaming cup of coffee, the morning sun filtering through the dusty blinds. The letter sat in front of me, crisp and clean. I'd gone over it at least a dozen times, checking every detail. It looked perfect. Across the top in bold, official-looking font were the words, Farm Utility Homeowners Association, FAA. The letter was loaded with legal-sounding nonsense. Phrases like unauthorized power consumption, compliance penalties, and legal ramifications were scattered throughout the text. Tim had helped me get the tone just right, formal but not over the top. It had that cold corporate sting that made your stomach drop the second you read it. And then there was a fine, $10,000. Enough to scare Kerren into a full-blown meltdown, but not so outrageous that she'd immediately think it was fake. Tim had said $10,000 was the sweet spot, enough to cause panic, but still believable. I tucked the letter into a thick white envelope and sealed it with a bright red Final Notice stamp. Just holding it in my hands gave me a little thrill. Next, I called up my buddy Mike, who worked for a local delivery service. Hey, Mike, can you do me a favor? Sure. What's up? I need you to deliver a letter for me. No signature required. Just drop it at the door. Mike chuckled. You in trouble? Not me. I smiled, just helping the universe balance itself. 20 minutes later, I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, as Mike pulled up to Kerren's driveway. He hopped out of the truck, walked up to her porch, and slipped the envelope into her mailbox. From my chair, I saw Kerren's curtains twitch. The door opened, and there she was, in her fuzzy slippers and floral robe, with that permanent look of judgment on her face. She pulled the envelope from the box and stared at it like it might explode. I leaned back in my chair, heart thumping. Here we go. Kerren tore open the envelope right there on the porch. I watched from across the fence as her eyes darted across the page, her brow furrowing, then lifting, then furrowing again. Her mouth dropped open. Then came the noise, a strangled, high-pitched shriek that startled a flock of birds from the trees. Oh, my God! I had to bite down on my lip to keep from laughing. Kerren stumbled back inside, clutching the letter like it was a court summons. A moment later, I heard the front door slam shut. Not even 5 minutes passed before my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I smiled and let it ring. No voicemail. 2 minutes later, it buzzed again. Kerren was probably pacing in her living room, trying to decide whether to cry or call a lawyer. From the window, I could see her shadow moving frantically back and forth. Her hands were flying through the air, probably yelling at Greg already. And the best part? She couldn't complain to the HOA, because as far as she knew, this was the HOA. Kerren's whole identity was wrapped up in the rules of the HOA. She knew them inside and out. But this was a rule she had never heard of, and that's exactly why it was driving her crazy. My phone buzzed again. I smiled and let it ring. Let her sweat. About an hour later, Kerren appeared again, but this time, Greg was with her. Poor Greg. He was a human version of a sigh, just tired and defeated all the time. He stood there on the porch, barefoot, squinting at the letter while Kerren jabbered in his ear. Greg scratched his head. I don't know, Kerren, 10 grand? That's a lot. It's an HOA fine. Kerren hissed. We can't ignore it. Greg frowned. But I've never heard of the Farm Utility Homeowners Association. Kerren's mouth twitched. Well, maybe it's new. Greg turned the letter over. It says subsection 12B of the Compliance Act. Did we sign something? Kerren let out an exaggerated sigh. Greg, it's not a question of what we signed. The HOA makes the rules. They don't need our permission. Greg rubbed his face. But if we didn't sign anything, I'm not arguing about this. Greg sighed and handed the letter back. Okay, do whatever you want. Kerren's eyes narrowed. I'm not letting this slide. I nearly laughed out loud when I saw her stomp down the driveway toward her little army of HOA devotees. Within minutes, Kerren had assembled a small group of neighbors on her lawn, Patricia, Gail, and Donna, all of them clutching their purses like they were bracing for battle. Kerren held the letter high above her head, like it was sacred scripture. This is outrageous, she shouted. Patricia adjusted her sunglasses. But if it's from the HOA, Kerren's eyes flashed. It's not legitimate. Patricia frowned. Well, it looks official. Kerren's face darkened. It's a scam. Patricia hesitated. But you did plug into his barn, didn't you? Kerren whipped around so fast that Patricia took a step back. I did no such thing. I figured that was my cue. I walked toward the fence line, hands in my pockets. Afternoon, Kerren. Her head snapped toward me. Jake, did you know about this? I glanced at the letter. About what? Kerren stomped toward me and shoved the letter in my face. This fraudulent bill. I raised an eyebrow. Looks pretty official to me. Kerren's nostrils flared. I did not plug into your barn. I pulled out my phone. Oh, really? I tapped the screen and played the hidden camera footage. Kerren, caught in the act, dragging the extension cord across my lawn and plugging it into the barn. The silence that followed was glorious. Patricia's jaw dropped. Gail stepped back. Donna let out a quiet, "Oh, my." Kerren's mouth opened and closed. That's fake. Sure it is. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. But if you want to dispute it, you can take it up with the HOA. Kerren's face flushed deep red. I smiled. Good luck with that. The next day, Tim showed up at Kerren's house in a suit and tie, clipboard in hand. He rang the doorbell 3 times, looking like the most professional compliance officer you've ever seen. Kerren answered the door, eyes wide. Who are you? Tim adjusted his glasses. Ma'am, I'm here on behalf of the Farm Utility Homeowners Association. We've received a report of unauthorized power usage. Kerren's mouth opened and closed. I don't understand. Tim held out a piece of paper. This is a notice of power disconnection. You have 72 hours to remit payment or face immediate shutoff. Kerren swayed slightly. But Tim gave her a practiced, patient smile. Ma'am, I suggest you comply. The penalties increase after 72 hours. Kerren's hands shook as she took the paper. Tim tipped his head. Have a nice day. That evening, I watched from my porch as Kerren paced her front yard. phone pressed to her ear. She was frantic, calling the real electric company, probably trying to figure out if any of this was real. Greg finally walked outside, hands stuffed in his pockets. "Kerren, what are you doing?" "Fixing this." Greg sighed. "Kerren, maybe you should just pay it." Kerren's face twisted in horror. "Never." I smiled and sipped my coffee. She wasn't beaten yet, but she was close, and I wasn't finished. It started with a knock on Kerren's door. I was in the barn when the white utility truck pulled up in front of her house. Two workers in reflective vests and hard hats climbed out, carrying clipboards and toolkits. I leaned against the barn door, wiping my hands on my jeans, and watched the show unfold. Kerren must have spotted them from the window, because the door swung open, and she practically ran down the driveway. "Wait, what are you doing?" she called, her voice high-pitched and sharp. One of the workers, a stocky guy with a mustache, gave her a polite nod. "Ma'am, we're here to investigate a report of unauthorized power usage." Kerren's mouth twitched. "That's not possible. There's been a misunderstanding." The worker flipped through his clipboard. "Well, according to our records, power from a neighboring property has been routed to your house." Kerren's face flushed. "No, that's ridiculous. I would never." "We just need to check the lines," the other worker said calmly. Kerren's hands fluttered at her sides. This isn't necessary." The workers weren't interested in hearing it. They headed toward the side of her house with practiced efficiency. Kerren scrambled after them, still talking, but now her tone was slipping into desperation. I set my wrench down and strolled toward the fence line. About 10 minutes later, the workers came back around the side of the house, looking more serious this time. Kerren followed closely behind, arms crossed over her chest. The mustached worker sighed. "Ma'am, we found evidence of tampering with the main line." Kerren's face went pale. "Tampering? I didn't." "And the power drawn from your neighbor's property," the other worker added, glancing toward me, "is considered theft under state law." Kerren's mouth opened and closed. "The fines for this type of violation start at $25,000, the mustache worker continued. "But depending on the extent of the damage, you could be looking at more." Kerren's knees actually wobbled. "But we'll send you the official notice in the mail," the worker said. "Have a nice day." Kerren stood there frozen as a utility truck pulled away. I watched her from across the fence. Slowly, her head turned toward me. Her mouth tightened. I smiled and gave her a little wave. Kerren turned on her heel and stormed inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the porch light. Justice had arrived, and it had a $25,000 price tag. For the first time in 2 years, Kerren went quiet. No complaints about the height of my grass. No HOA violation notices in my mailbox. No passive-aggressive comments at the farmer's market. It was peaceful. Later that evening, I was fixing a latch on the barn door when Greg wandered over. He stood on the other side of the fence, hands stuffed in his pockets, looking like a man who had just finished running a marathon. "Hey," I said, giving him a nod. Greg sighed. "Hey." I set down the hammer. "Rough day." Greg rubbed the back of his neck. "You could say that." I waited. Greg's eyes drifted toward the house. "You know, I told her this was going to backfire." I smiled. "You did, huh?" Greg nodded. "She didn't listen." "She never does." Greg chuckled softly. "Yeah." He hesitated, then looked at me. "Listen, I know she's not easy, and I know you had every right to handle this differently. I could have called the cops," I admitted. "Yeah," Greg said, his expression softening. "But you didn't." I shrugged. "Didn't need to. The universe took care of it." Greg smiled faintly. "Well, thanks for not rubbing her face in it. I think the $25,000 fine will handle that." Greg laughed. "Yeah, probably." We stood there for a moment, the quiet settling between us. Greg nodded toward the barn. "So all good on your end?" "Power steady," I said. "No more flickering." Greg smiled. "Good." He stood there for another moment, like he wanted to say something else. But then he just nodded and started back toward the house. Halfway up the driveway, he glanced back at me. Jake, yeah, she's not as tough as she looks. I smiled. I know. Greg gave a small nod and disappeared inside. A week later, the HOA held a meeting. I didn't go, but Tim did. And boy, did he give me the full rundown afterward. Kerren showed up reluctantly and took her usual seat at the head of the table. But this time, the room didn't feel the same. Kerren, Patricia said, clearing her throat, we need to discuss the incident. Kerren's eyes narrowed. What incident? Patricia slid a piece of paper across the table. This one. Kerren's eyes darted to the paper. The official notice from the electric company. Patricia crossed her arms. You were stealing power? Kerren sat up straighter. It's not. It was a misunderstanding. Doesn't look like a misunderstanding, Donna said. Kerren's face turned red. I didn't know. But you did. Patricia cut in, and now the neighborhood is paying for it. Kerren's mouth tightened. I'm handling it. Are you? Patricia asked. Kerren's eyes flashed. This is irrelevant to HOA business. It's completely relevant. Patricia shot back. If you can't follow the rules, how can you expect the rest of us to? Kerren's lips parted like she was about to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time since she'd become president, Kerren didn't have control of the room. 2 days later, she resigned. For personal reasons. Yeah, sure, Kerren. The neighborhood felt different after Kerren stepped down. Quieter, lighter. No more emails about fence height or mailbox colors. No more Kerren peeking through her curtains, looking for violations. One afternoon, Greg walked over while I was mending a section of fence. She's adjusting, he said. Yeah. Greg smiled faintly. It's a process. I chuckled. She's learning to let go. Greg's eyes softened. Maybe. He looked toward the house. She's embarrassed. She'll never admit it. But I nodded. She'll get over it. Hope so. Greg smiled, then turned to leave. Oh, one more thing. Yeah. Thanks. I smiled. Anytime. A few days later, I put up a new sign in the barn. It was an old wooden plank I'd sanded down and painted by hand. Headquarters of the Farm Utility Homeowners Association, just in case Kerren ever got any more ideas. That afternoon, I sat on the porch, Bessie chewing lazily on a patch of grass nearby. The barn lights glowed steadily in the early evening dusk. From across the fence, Kerren stood at her window. She wasn't glaring this time, just watching. I tipped my hat toward her. For a second, she hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, she gave me a small nod. Progress. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cool evening breeze settle over the farm. Justice had been served with interest. And Kerren? She'd finally learned the golden rule of the HOA. Don't mess with a farmer.